The wind enters first, dry, whispering through blackjack oak leaves, as if they were pages in some weathered ledger. Heat holds its breath. Stones the color of scorched wheat mound over a grave along Turkey Creek, and a small plaque catches the light. John Ringo, July 13th, 1882. Here the desert remembers what people argue about. It remembers a single shot and a man found seated in the fork of roots where the shade was kindest at mid-afternoon. It remembers boots that were not on his feet, and a revolver with one chamber speaking louder than all the rumors that would follow. But before the hush of this canyon, there was noise. A wagon train creaking toward a promise. Johnny Ringo came crying into the world May 3rd, 1850, at Greens Fork, Indiana. And by the time he was tall enough to peer over a wagon sideboard, the family had already moved twice, chasing steadier ground. In the summer of 1864, they joined a California-bound company rolling out of Missouri. Oxen bowing to the yoke, women tying sunbonnets against the glare, boys balancing between awe and fear at the size of the plains. Somewhere west of what would become Glenrock, Wyoming, on the Oregon-California Trail, Johnny's father, Martin Ringo, stepped down from a wagon at first light with a shotgun in his hands. The weapon fired. He fell. They buried him on a wind-brushed rise near the road, one more grave on a trail lined with them. And then, with no better choice, the family moved on. A boy who sees a father lowered into the traveling earth can learn to live with ghosts. California gave the Ringos roofs, work, and kin. For a time they lodged with Coleman Younger, married to Johnny's aunt, an ordinary domestic fact that later fed the West's habit of connecting every thread to an outlaw tapestry. Johnny was bright, quiet, at ease with print as well as a pistol, but the ground kept sloping away from peace. By 1869, he drifted again, this time to Texas, to a hill country of live oaks and limestone, where cattle money ran hot and fast and tempers hotter still. There, men argued over brands and borders, and sometimes the argument ended with a rope thrown over a live oak limb. They called it the Mason County War, and later the Hoodoo War, a feud with no clean ledger, where masked riders, hoodoos, some said, worked by torchlight and buckshot, and the law blessed one side in the morning and the other by sundown. It began with rustling and a jailbreak, with 5 men dragged from a cell and lynched near Hick Springs. Then Tim Williamson, a rancher accused of theft, was taken under color of law and shot dead along the road. A former ranger named Scott Cooley, Williamson's friend and foster son, swore revenge and began to keep a list. Johnny Ringo rode beside him. The neighbors said it was German against American-born. The truth was simpler and meaner. Fear against fear, each man certain he was next. Names buckled under the weight of grief. Deputy John Worley was murdered and scalped. A gunfight broke out near Keller's store on the Llano. A man named Moses Baird was killed. Ringo and a rider called Bill Williams went to the home of James Cheney, the man accused of luring Baird to his death, and Cheney died on his own threshold. Some say he was preparing breakfast when they arrived. All agree he didn't live to eat it. If a code existed, it was simple arithmetic. One outrage balanced by another until the slate cracked. What did it do to a young man to gallop inside such weather? The newspapers made Ringo a symbol, a headline, a rumor with spurs. He and Cooley were arrested, then sent shuttling between jails as friends surrounded the cells and whispered keys through the bars. In November 1876, they caught Ringo again in Llano County, and he spent much of 1876-77 behind stone, his horizon a slit of sky. Cases crawled through courts. Witnesses forgot or vanished or remembered too well. In May 1878, the murder case against him was dismissed. In the fall, he wore a different badge. The vote of his neighbors made him constable of Loyal Valley Precinct 4, proof that even a feudist could trade fame for trust, at least for a season. Then the trail called him onward. It is easy, reading backward, to pretend the roads were set, that a boy who watched his father die in dust had to become a man who carried dust inside him, that Texas had to boil, that Arizona had to beckon, that a black hat had to mean what it meant in dime novels and later movies. Yet in the record are small, resistant facts. Ringo could be mannerly, even soft-spoken. Some said he read more than most. Others saw only the short fuse lit by whiskey. He moved between those portraits like a rider switching horses at a relay, whichever animal would carry him farthest from yesterday. By December 1879, the road bent toward Arizona territory. Cattle boomed, silver boomed louder, and the town named Tombstone rose from alkali as if conjured by a gambler's shuffle. Men came for wages under the ground and for the tasting rights at saloon bars. Women came for the work the papers didn't print. Where money gathers in a hurry, the six-gun follows. Ringo made the crossing with an old Texas ally, Joseph Graves Olney, Joe Hill to those who had reason not to use proper names. And it did not take long for Arizona to learn the temper that Texas already knew. In Safford, a drunken quarrel turned ugly when Louis Hancock refused a whiskey and asked for beer. Ringo pistol-whipped him and fired. The ball pierced Hancock's ear and neck. By luck or grace, the man lived. The press did not forget the shooter's name. Neither did the law. Yet the outline of Ringo's passage through Texas is not only the work of whiskey and wrath, it is also the shape of the world he moved in. The hill country of the 1870s was a patchwork. Families from Tennessee and Georgia trying to hold on to herds, German shopkeepers and butchers who brought festivals, orderliness, and their own notion of justice, rangers who were saints in one story and sinners in the next. The feud was the county's broken mirror. Each man looked and saw his own wounds looking back. Ringo's name hardened there, not solely from the killing he did or didn't do, but because the county itself learned to pronounce violence fluently. When the courthouse burned in January 1877, the records that might have absolved or damned men with certainty curled into smoke. Memory, always a poor bookkeeper, was left to do the sums. So the horizon opened, as horizons do, with a whisper of money in new canyons. Arizona glimmered. Tombstone's loads were rich enough to pull capital from San Francisco and hope from men who had already sold their best years to the saddle. Ringo turned his horse that way, carrying the hill country's lessons in his pocket like tarnished coins. He would spend them all in Cocos County. The man in black was not yet a legend. He was just another rider between jobs, another temper in search of a test, another man with a past trying to pass unnoticed into a town that noticed everything. And still, if you stand at Turkey Creek and listen, you can hear the earlier wind, the plains wind that curled over the boy's father's grave, the courthouse draft that licked paper to flame, the hill country norther that set mesquite to shiver. The West taught Ringo how easily a day can turn, how a breakfast can become an epitaph, how a lawman's badge and a gunman's draw can ride the same vest. These were not lessons a book could keep. They were written on the land, and the land remembers. The rider who arrives in Arizona in the winter of 1879 carries more than a six-gun. He carries a ledger written in other men's hands. And whatever balance he hoped to strike in Tombstone, the debt, his and the county's, was already accruing interest. Arizona begins as a mirage, a silver rumor on a high desert wind. Ringo and his trail partner, Joseph Graves Olney, Joe Hill to some, because aliases are the West's second language, crossed the line in the winter of 1879 with dust in their cuffs and a hunger that ordinary pay rarely quiets. The road tilts toward the Gila and the sulfur bite of mesquite smoke, toward towns that have not quite decided whether they are camps or cities. To the south, a new name is beginning to harden on maps: Tombstone. To the east, little river settlements and stage stops that smell of sweat, barley, and spilled spirits. The country is open, made of blue mountains that refuse to be measured, and arroyos that make fools of men who trust them after rain. Every mile is a wager. Every doorway along a clapboard street can be a courtroom if a six-gun is the judge. In Safford, night comes on fast and warm. Beer has a way of speaking its mind. The saloon is a lantern-lit box of sound. Piano clatter, poker chips whirring at luck, the woof of bottles set down hard. Ringo is drunk, the easy kind of drunk that simmers into the dangerous kind without announcing itself. He offers a glass of whiskey to a man named Louis Hancock, a casual flourish that could have passed like a shrug. Hancock demurs, says he prefers beer. Some nights that would have been a joke, the kind that evaporates when the piano hits a sweet note. But not tonight. The pistol comes low and fast. The butt flashes. The report is close enough to taste. Hancock staggers, a furrow ripped past ear and neck. Lucky the ball has two minds about killing him. The room stares at the court of smoke as it climbs toward the lamp's soot. The piano lid closes like a church door. What does a man say afterward? What can he say that will weigh more than the sound of that shot? The newspapers say it for him. Ringo's name arrives in print like an old debt. Between that shot and the sunrise on New Year's Day, a legend begins to lace itself around the man in the black coat. No proclamation, no oath, only the way he carries himself, the way he pierces a room without seeming to look at it, the way the brim of the hat makes a shadow a little darker than it needs to be. He is not the loudest of the riders who haunt the far edges of the San Pedro. In fact, the loud men often quiet down when he's near. He has the kind of voice that doesn't travel far, but carries weight when it lands. He can be courteous. He can be frost. He gives you the impression he has already measured your choices and will not be surprised by whichever you pick. South and west, Tombstone rises as if built on a dare. Stamp mills hammer on the San Pedro at Charleston and Contention City, beating ore to a slurry of hope, while mules clatter through the gulches with sacks that promise a fortune if the assay says so. The streets of town are a long argument between money and mud, hitching rails crowded with horses that cost 3 months' wages, plank sidewalks crowded with men who could buy half the block if their next load pans. Saloons stack along Allen and Fremont in an amber cascade. Beer from Tucson, whiskey from everywhere. Strong coffee for men who must head back underground before the hangover has time to tie its boots. There is a new courthouse smell on some corners, and a gallows smell on others. If the town were a man, he'd be young, rich, and fond of trouble. Into this ecosystem rides Ringo, farther from the Texas quarrels that built his reputation, but not far enough from himself. The men he gravitates toward call themselves cowboys, sometimes with pride, and sometimes with a grin that says the word itself is camouflage. They are a loose confederacy of ranch hands, riders, and opportunists who move cattle as often across the border as within it. The line between rustling and ranching here is as thin as a mesquite thorn. Claims stutter and change hands. A steer can be worth a shootout if the right eyes are watching. Ike Clanton broods and blusters. Curly Bill, Brocious laughs with a mouthful of threats. Sheriff Johnny Bean, a politician with an armadillo's knack for survival, always seems to be standing where the light falls best. Ringo is not a leader of these men. He is not their errand boy either. He is the man who makes a room recalibrate. Tombstone, for all its bravado, hates the sight of a pistol under a coat and says so by ordinance. The mines demand order. Investors demand predictability. The town council wears respectability, like a fresh necktie, even if the knot is a little crooked. Men tuck their iron away when they come up Allen, and if they don't, the law is supposed to persuade them. That is the idea anyway. Ideas do not always survive contact with the frontier. What survives is the kind of truce that must be renegotiated every afternoon. The cowboys disdain town boys who quote lines about civilization while cashing the checks that cowboy cattle make possible. The town boys disdain men who believe a good horse and a quicker draw are a philosophy. The argument has no conclusion, only episodes, like a serialized story the audience can't stop buying. Somewhere in that unsettled ground, Ringo speaks with Sam Purdy of the Tombstone epitaph. The editor will later recall the words in a way that chills the spine. Ringo says he's as sure of being killed as he is of being alive. May last a couple of years, he says, or not 2 days. It is not theater. It is arithmetic. He has lived long enough in places where the odds don't stack in your favor unless you stack them yourself. He sees the way a street can swerve into a killing ground because 2 men took the wrong steps. He sees how people remember the dead and forget the afternoon that made dying the only move left. Ringo's name circulates with stories, some true, some sandblown, most of them useful to the teller. A few say he quotes Shakespeare. A few others say he quotes nothing and lets silence hang like rope. More than one gambler observes he drinks like a man who has misplaced a map. And yet there are evenings when he's steady, sociable, almost refined, talking literature beside a pot-belly stove in a boarding house parlor while thunderheads pile over the dragoons and lightning braids the far ridges in blue-white strands. He is not an outlaw king. He is not a saint felled by bad company. He is a man of means and mood, of reading and rage. The black coat becomes a sign because it is easier to make sense of a color than a character. Drift outward from town and you feel the rest of his terrain. South along the San Pedro, the mesquite's squat and prickly pear widen their sprawl. North in the whetstones, catclaw and beargrass stake their claims. East, the dragoons lift a granite shoulder. In July, thunder rolls like wagons you can't see, and the smell of creosote after rain makes even a hard man consider how small he is. In January, the wind slices. Ringo learns the creeks and crossings, the quicksand trickery of certain washes, the ranches where a man can water his horse, and the ones where he'd best keep riding. He is at home in motion. Behind every saloon door hangs a political map no cartographer ever drew. Before Cochise County is carved out, Tombstone lives under the reach of Pima County's power. Afterward, the names shift, the badges turn, alliances jump. The effect is the same. Men with law on their lips and grudges in their pockets. Some evenings, Wyatt Earp and his brothers walk Allen Street with purpose you can hear in their boot heels, and the cowboys slide their eyes toward the doorways as if the hinges might adjudicate. Ringo is not the center of this cyclone, but he is near enough that when the wind rises, it pulls at his coattails. That is the weight of his reputation as the man in black. Not that he always dressed the part, though he favored sober clothes and a brim that stole a man's measure, but that he represented a kind of concentrated risk. You could sit at a table with him and never once fear a raised voice, and yet you knew the room would take instruction from his hands if they went to leather. In a territory where posture is currency, Ringo is solvent. In a town where memory is as short as the distance between two pistols, he is unforgettable. He has not yet crossed words with Doc Holliday in a way to draw blood, not yet felt the sudden gravity that pulls the Earps and the cowboys into the same narrow orbit. That will come, as sure as monsoon clouds stack in July. For now he walks Tombstone like a man taking the measure of a stage he did not build, but understands better than many of the actors. He knows how the back doors open onto alleys, and who owns the buildings, whose upstairs windows burn late. He knows the barkeeps who can be trusted and the ones who would sell your story to the morning edition. He knows the sound a town makes when it is about to change, like a mill slowing, like a card scraping a table, like a hammer drawing back to the first notch. Some nights he sleeps hard, the way men do when their bodies take their own counsel. Others he stays up until the lamps gutter and the barflies become shadows and the shadows talk. He does not explain himself. He does not need to. Arizona explains him, this expanse that turns a man's choices into headlines and his silences into rumor. When the dawn belly crawls up Fremont Street and the mules begin another day's work, Ringo's hat tips at the same angle as yesterday. He eats when he remembers. He drinks when he forgets. He listens for a chord only he can hear, the one that tells him when to leave a room, a town, a life. Soon enough, he'll need that ear. Soon enough, the street will narrow, and the seconds will thicken, and the law that hates pistols will learn again how little it can do when pride and fear decide to talk at the same time. For now, Arizona holds him, part citizen, part thunderhead, part rumor wearing boots. The saloons know his name. The printers set his letters in lead with a little more ink around them. The cowboys count him as a man you want on your side if a conversation sours. The men who imagine themselves the town's backbone count him as a test they hope not to fail. And the man himself? He studies the corners of rooms and the angles of conversation and the arithmetic of odds. He has told one editor a truth most men don't say out loud, that he will not live long. All that remains is to find out how right he is and who will be with him when the sum is done. By the winter after the OK Corral, Tombstone breathed like a man with a cracked rib. Each inhale shallow, each exhale measured. The gunfight had not settled anything. It had only clarified the fault lines. On one side stood the town's idea of order. Judges who shaved each morning, merchants whose money came with ledgers, miners who wanted the night quiet enough to sleep before another shift. On the other, the broad back of the range. Riders who believed a six-gun was as ordinary as a pocket knife, who resented laws written in rooms they never entered. Between them ran Allen Street, as narrow as a fuse. Johnny Ringo was not at the OK Corral. That wasn't his battle. But the air that followed, the whisper, the watching, the sense that a second act had already been cast, belonged to him as much as to anyone. He moved through a town that had learned the music of fear, a door swinging too fast, a glass set down too hard, a horse blowing through its nose outside a saloon. Conversations lowered when he passed, not from panic, but from calculation. Ringo wasn't the loudest man in any room. He was the variable nobody could price. The Earps had come to believe that a clean street made a safe city, and a safe city kept the silver moving. They wore the certainty like a uniform. Virgil Earp, the town marshal, kept his hat brimmed forward and his patrol steady. Morgan smiled like a man who trusted his luck. Wyatt, carrying a federal commission, walked like a verdict. Their allies, Doc Holliday among them, gave the streets a sudden edge even when the weather was calm. The cowboys, for their part, Ike and Billy Clanton, Curly Bill Brocious, Tom and Frank McClory, Johnny Ringo, answered order with ridicule and pressure with presence. A town that has to choose between two breeds of stubborn soon learns to duck. The near collision everyone still talks about unfolded on January 17, 1882, on Allen Street, the day insisting on its spot in the ledger. It began as most deadly things do, in daylight, almost casually. Holliday, lean as a fence slat and twice as hard, carried the boiled-over scorn of a man who had buried too many friends and survived too many nights on cards and whiskey. Ringo, black coat, level eyes, the aftertaste of Texas in his temper, met him in the middle of the boardwalk's opinion. Words sharpened. Silence gathered around them like a ring drawn in the dust. There is a peculiar quiet that falls when two reputations face each other. Even the piano down the block seemed to choose its next notes more carefully. Hands drifted toward leather because hands do what they've trained to do. Holliday's mouth cut a line across his face. He could skewer with a phrase and had been practicing for years. Ringo didn't need to talk. He only needed to be there, the weight of him like a thumb on a scale. Then the law broke the spell. Chief of Police Jim Flynn, quick and thankless, stepped into the space where legend was about to be minted and turned it back into paperwork. He took their pistols. A judge took their money. The town ordinance against carrying weapons, hated by the cowboys, loved by investors, had its moment. Ringo and Holliday paid fines instead of blood. The lesson was bitter but brief. Tombstone had not averted a war. It had only postponed a chapter. Postponements end. On a dark December 1881 night, shotgun blasts tore into Virgil Earp as he crossed Fremont Street, splintering his left arm to ruin and marking the first of Tombstone's ambushes. In March 1882, a bullet found Morgan while he bent over a billiard table. The green felt bright with a sudden ruin that no doctor could mend. News runs faster than horses. The cowboys drank to the idea that balance had been restored. The Earps swallowed grief like lightning. The town took sides with the same fervor it once reserved for mining claims. Those who had watched the Allen Street standoff now understood it for what it had been, a warning, not a climax. Wyatt Earp answered the way a frontier lawman answers when courtrooms feel too small. He gathered a posse under the color of his federal authority and rode out on what history would call the vendetta ride, a grim arithmetic of pursuit. At the Tucson train yards, Frank Stillwell died under a dozen muzzle flashes. In the whetstone brush at Iron Springs, Curly Bill Brocious went down in a roar of shotgun and return fire. Rumor filled in everything the newspapers couldn't see, and where rumor hesitated, imagination volunteered. All the while, Cochise County's official sheriff, Johnny Bean, swore out papers, deputized who he could, and claimed the mantle of law even as he struggled to lay a hand on the men he sought. Here the record fixes Johnny Ringo in a role as clear as any stage direction. Bean's deputy, a badge pinned to a coat the town already recognized. It wasn't sentiment, it was geometry. With the Earps moving under federal authority and leaving the territories writ in tatters behind them, the county wanted its own steel. Ringo's task was plain: run down men who had taken justice into their own hands and returned it the worse for wear. He rode with others on dust-white roads, following tracks that were both obvious and impossible. They never quite close the distance. There are pursuits in which the gap itself becomes the whole story. If this alignment, Ringo opposite Wyatt and Doc, feels too neat, remember how the desert resists straight lines. Ringo's known loyalties tilted cowboy, yes. He drank and rode with men whom the Earps counted as enemies. But he also carried a personal creed that didn't shrink to another man's slogan. He had been a feudist in Texas, a constable for a season, a man quick to offense and capable of calm. The badge on his lapel in the spring of 1882 said one thing. The ledger of his life said another. He chased men across hard country because the law, this law at this hour, asked him to, and perhaps because he believed that even a crooked order was better than none at all. Tombstone during those weeks felt like a table with one leg shortening by the day. Businesses kept the lamps trimmed, but evening carried a waiting stillness, as if the town itself expected hoofbeats to break into a sprint at any moment. The miners went down their shafts pretending the streets would still be there when they came back up. The gamblers set cards and felt like men placing bets on the weather. Women swept stoops because it is good discipline to clean what you can. In the Oriental and the Alhambra, and every backroom saloon between them, men spoke softly about the next sunrise and whether it would bring more names for the undertaker to carve. Ringo, who had once predicted to an editor that he might last a couple of years or not 2 days, wore the prophecy like a coat you can't take off even in July. He was seen in this camp, that ranch, quiet and intent, the black of his attire less a costume than a mood. When the posse he rode with failed to snag the Earps on the trail, he returned to town with dust in his teeth and a look that said the arithmetic would not come out even. Some claimed he grew more solitary. Others said he drank more deeply and smiled less. It is possible both are true. Few men are improved by chasing ghosts they cannot catch. And so the wires drew tighter, not toward another grand showdown, but toward something more ordinary and more fatal. Weariness, the kind that sits in bone and won't be talked out of it. The cowboys had lost a pillar in Curly Bill. The Earps had buried a brother and left town under the protective shadow of federal titles in quieter states. In the vacuum, men like Ringo, men without a tidy ending, became the last pieces on a board no one wanted to keep playing. He walked Allen Street with the same measured step, but the step spoke now of distances only he could see. What the town feared most was not a single gunfight. It was the daily possibility that any errand might turn into a story families would have to tell for the rest of their lives. You could buy a loaf, send a letter, look up when a chair scraped, and find yourself living inside someone else's legend. Ringo understood this better than most. He had spent a life learning how much damage a rumor can do when given fresh cartridges. When his badge work wound down, when the Earps had faded into the horizon they chose, when Behan's paperwork curled at the edges on a desk too warm for the season, Johnny Ringo remained in a town that had no more grand gestures left, only men in their habits. Soon the calendar would reach July 1882, with its fireworks and its storms, and the smell of wet dust rising from the dragoon stones. Soon the last chase would be a private one, along a canyon that remembered what men forget. But in the tense spring that led there, Tombstone looked at the man in black and saw two futures, one where he became a headline and one where he slipped away between the oaks and left only questions. The difference between those futures was a single second, a single trigger weight, a single choice. It always is, out here. The 4th of July reached Tombstone hot and loud, the sky stitched with firecrackers and pistol echoes masquerading as patriotism. Brass bands banged out marches, men in shirt sleeves raced Mustangs up Allen Street, women fanned themselves on porches where bunting sagged in the heat. Somewhere in that bright noise, Johnny Ringo tipped a bottle too often. He had the look of a man who wanted to put more distance between himself and his thoughts than a horse could carry. By midnight, the street's laughter had thinned to a hard edge. A week that should have been all celebration began instead to feel like a fuse. Over the next days, the monsoon teased the dragoons, anvil-headed clouds stacking in the east, a ragged scent of rain arriving before the drops did. Ringo drifted out of town and back again, then out for good with a bottle or two tucked into his gear, heading toward the oaks and boulders that corrugate West Turkey Creek. A deputy who crossed his path in the hills remembered him years later as very drunk, reeling in the saddle, a rider carried by his horse more than guiding it. Whether it was despair, a drunkard's ordinary drift, or a man merely burning off restlessness, only the rider knew. The country he entered was high, oak-dotted, and deceptive. Distances look shorter than they are. Shade and water don't always collude where you need them. By the 13th, the heat had a hammer in it. A wood hauler named James Yost drove his team up the canyon road past B.F. Smith's place, where a ribbon of water cut through stone, and the oaks cast a decent shadow by mid-afternoon. Somewhere nearby, close enough that the sound would have carried to the ranch. A single shot cracked and then died without an echo. The Chiricahuas swallowed it. No posse thundered. No second shot marked a skirmish. Just the one, abrupt as a period. On that same road the next day, Yost pulled his team and squinted across the creek. There in the forked roots of a blackjack oak sat a man whose stillness did not look like sleep. The hat brim slouched over the face. The body leaned as if listening to the shade. Yost climbed down, crossed through the brush, and saw the blackened skin of a day-old corpse. The right hand closed around the grip of a .45 Colt. A single chamber was empty. The death had the terrible tidiness of an answer no one wanted. Word ran quick to the ranch and then outward. Neighbors, hands, a deputy. Before long, men had gathered who knew what to do when bad luck or bad judgment met a six-gun. They looked for tracks. There were some, scuffed and confused, where a horse had milled. They looked for a struggle, none obvious. The feet told a stranger story. Ringo wore no boots. Instead, strips of cloth, torn from an undershirt, were wrapped around both feet, the makeshift bandages dust-stiff and dark. Whoever he had been the day before, this man had walked for a time without leather between him and the earth, or else had tried to save ruined feet with the only bandage handy. They found the clue the canyon gives every so often: a horse, spooked and gone, later caught with boots tied to the saddle. Men who know saddles and hang ropes nodded at that. Tying boots on is an old trail trick when feet blister or a rider means to ford and keep them dry. The simple tale suggested itself. A drunk rider loses his seat or gives his mount its head. The animal bolts and leaves him to walk. He wraps his feet. He staggers on towards shade and water. The harder tale waited 10 yards away beneath an oak. The coroner's jury was assembled as the law then required. Local men with enough level in them to read a scene. They saw what Yost had seen and more. The bullet had entered Ringo's right temple and exited on a higher line at the back of the head. An upward track consistent with a man seated low, arm bent, pistol angled up from right to left. Some muttered about powder burns and whether the skin, already blackened by desert heat, would show them. Others, more pragmatic, noted that bodies turned fast in an Arizona July and that the lack of soot on skin 3/4 cooked by the sun proved little. They logged the single discharge chamber. They logged the position of the gun, a Colt single action, where it would be if the shooter held it. They logged the scant distance to water and to the ranch road, the way the oak's roots made a cradle where a weary man could settle and rest his spine. A man's pockets in such cases are a ledger of sorts. Ringo's carried small, ordinary things, a little cash, some cartridges, nothing that bent the narrative away from what the body already said. If there was a note on his person, no record of it survives in the testimony. What did survive was the jury's plain verdict: suicide. The men signed their names to it. Names that would mean little outside the canyon but would matter years later when dime novels and recollections began to polish other endings. They buried him there because removal over such ground in that heat would have been a cruelty to the living and a poor courtesy to the dead. The grave went in beneath the same tree, stones stacked to keep coyotes honest, as close to the shade as the roots would allow. No preacher appears in the record, no scripture, only the hasty human work of men who have seen too many ends and do not care to overcomplicate another. In time, a marker would declare the name and date. At first, the place remembered him without help. The geography of that death matters. West Turkey Creek is not the lonesome waste outsiders imagine when they say Arizona. It is a narrow corridor of life scoring down from the Chiricahua Mountains, the kind of side canyon where oaks lean toward water and summer storms prowl with afternoon regularity. If you've walked long with a dry throat and a hangover's hammer in your skull, the sight of that shade is almost medicinal. Ringo was yards, just yards, from water and reprieve. That fact made the story either simpler or sadder, depending on the angle you take. A man who has nearly made it chooses to stop. A man who has nearly made it is stopped. A man who misjudges one last time and sits to think too long with a loaded Colt in his hand. The canyon doesn't argue. It holds all three readings and keeps its own counsel. In town, the news folded itself into existing prejudices. Those who hated him or feared him called it a fitting finish. Those who liked him said the desert had murdered another decent man who had lost his way. Doc Holliday's friends shrugged that Ringo, for all his manners, had a temper that drank hard. The cowboys said the Earps had hounded a man until he broke. The Earps' allies said whiskey and bad company had done what no honest court could. The grave gathered those opinions the way a creek gathers leaves after the first storm, briefly bright, then sodden and indistinguishable. There were, of course, the immediate whispers that someone else had done the work. An unseen hand in the oaks, a shot from a man who knew how to vanish. But the inquest men had been close to the body. They had seen the angle. They had felt the heavy logic of the scene. One of them would still be saying it half a century later. I called it suicide then. I call it the same now. Frontier juries had their failings, but they had a practical understanding of how men use guns on themselves and of what a faked scene usually looks like. This one lacked the clumsy signatures of artifice. No drag marks, no stage scatter, no footprints that told a different tale than the hands did. Out in the canyon, the storm finally kept its promise. A late afternoon rain stitched the dust, and the oak's leaves whispered the news into the creek's small song. The grave settled. Turkey Creek returned to its business. Birds, insects, the occasional teamster clattering by. Tombstone learned, as towns must, how quickly a name that has filled 1,000 conversations can be reduced to a line in a ledger and a rumor men trade in barbershops when the chair is slow. If you go there now, if you stand with your hat in your hand because the heat insists, you can see how easily a man could have misjudged his own strength. You can step the distance from the road to the tree, from the tree to the water, and feel in your own legs the calculus of a July afternoon. You can imagine a rider, sick with liquor and memory, bandaging his feet with the last clean cloth he had, setting his back against rough bark, and looking out at a little slice of light where the canyon opens. You can imagine the way a man's mind climbs a ladder of thoughts and misses a rung, and you can hear, if you're the listening kind, the echo left by one shot on a hot day, an answer that silenced 100 questions and created 100 more. The man in black did not die on a main street under the eyes of enemies and a crowd ready to swear to heroes. He died the way most men die, alone, within the small circle of his own choices, in a place that was doing its ordinary work before he arrived and would go on doing it after. The frontier gives many kinds of endings. This one was quiet, final, and, like the desert itself, unimpressed by legend. Rumor rides longer than a good horse. Before the cairn at Turkey Creek had settled, the story began to wander, picking up new riders at every town. Some swore the man in black would never have turned a pistol on himself. Others said whiskey could turn any man inward, and the colt merely hurried what despair had already decided. If you listen carefully to that July, you can hear both voices at once, the practical and the romantic, arguing across the years like two card sharps guarding the same pot. The first whisper wears a celebrity's face, Wyatt Earp. In saloons and back rooms, the tale took on cinema-ready shape. Wyatt slipping back into Arizona after the Vendetta ride, finding Ringo drunk and mean in the Oaks, a rifle's single crack ending a rivalry too large for courtrooms. The trouble with a perfect story is the paper underneath. When historians pulled the ledger, Earp's versions did not marry the facts. In some retellings, he placed himself in Arizona months before Ringo died. In others, he denied it in print and later reclaimed it in private. When a story must change costumes that often just to stay alive, the costume becomes the point. The coroner's record at Turkey Creek did not need Wyatt Earp to make sense. The legend did. The second whisper gives the trigger to Doc Holliday. The idea has a cinematic satisfaction. The lean Georgian with the gambler's stare finishing a duel that Tombstone had denied them that January day on Allen Street. But the rail timetables and court dockets are stubborn. Holliday was in Colorado that month, Salida by the 7th, Pueblo for court on the 11th, again noted by the papers on the 14th, and in Leadville by the 18th. Put a ruler to the map and the miles grow unreasonable. Add the fact that an Arizona murder warrant still hung over Holliday's head, and the notion that he'd slipped back across a hostile border to perform a theatrical killing starts to look like whiskey talk. The West is large, even legends cannot be in two places at once. A later generation tried to bind the Wyatt version between hardcovers. I Married Wyatt Earp, presented as the widow Josephine Earp's intimate memoir, gave readers the sneaking thrill that history had finally whispered its secrets. Then the floorboards gave way. Scholars and journalists pressed the author-compiler Glenn Boyer for his source manuscripts. His answers tangled. Accusations of fabrication multiplied. By the time the smoke cleared, many of the book's most vivid claims, including versions that put Wyatt on the scene at Turkey Creek, were treated in the history trade as hoax or worse. The frontier loves a good yarn. Publishers do too. But a stitched seam is not a scar. If not Wyatt and not Doc, then who? A prison boasts its own literature, and in Yuma, one inmate embroidered the tale from behind bars. Buckskin Frank Leslie, already doing time for murdering his wife, reportedly told a guard he had put Ringo down. That confession never learned to walk. It reads like a man trying on a famous coat to see if it fit. Researchers who have trailed the dust of that claim mostly hang it back on the peg. Flashy, yes, but wrong size. Another name creeps in from the edge of the board. Michael Johnny Behind the Deuce O'Rourke, a quick-tempered gambler who had once slipped a lynch mob with help from the Earps, and then slipped Arizona altogether. Some versions have him sneaking back to settle accounts. Gratitude to Wyatt, grievance with Ringo, a bullet in the Oaks to balance both. But the paper again proves thin. O'Rourke had his own murder cloud over him, every reason not to ride back into a territory that wanted his neck. Even Fred Dodge's second-hand gossip and Stuart Lake's flair for embroidery cannot give the theory boots that hold water. To weigh the stories, you have to go back to the tree, the only witness that never revised its tale. The coroner's jury found Ringo seated, Colt in his right hand, one chamber empty, the track of the bullet upward from the right temple and out the back of the head. His feet were wrapped in cloth torn from his undershirt, his boots later turned up tied to the saddle of the horse that had run. Those details fit a sad, familiar geometry. A drunk and blistered rider loses his mount, pads his feet, reaches water's edge and shade, and quits. Critics point to the lack of reported powder burns, but the men who saw the body also saw the July sun's swift work. Ringo was already blackened by the heat. Burn signs do not announce themselves on a canvas half-cooked. The jury did not hesitate. They wrote one word: suicide. Contemporaneous papers, closer to the dust than our armchairs, printed the same conclusion. The Arizona Daily Star told its readers a self-inflicted shot had ended the reign of a man many called the Cowboy's King. The epitaph carried the news with a frontier blend of fatalism and restraint. You can feel in those columns a town tired of being a character in somebody else's dime novel. And there is the testimony that cannot be staged. The voices of men who lifted the body, looked into the wound, and signed their names beneath the verdict. Robert Buller, who served on the jury, lived long enough to watch the stories multiply like mesquite and to reject them one by one. 52 years later, he was still saying it plain. We called it suicide then, we call it suicide now. Sometimes history is a door you can rattle forever, never finding a new room behind it. Yet myth is a living animal, and it must eat. Why do the alternative endings persist? Partly because Johnny Ringo built a persona that seemed to demand a louder last act. A man in black does not, in our imagination, die sitting quietly under a tree. He dies center stage across 10 paces at high noon. Partly because the forces that shape Tombstone, greed, grievance, the friction between town and range, needed a final symbol, and a suicide refuses to serve as a symbol for anything except private sorrow. And partly because other legends, Wyatt the unbending law, Doc the fatal friend, grew brighter when reflected in an enemy's blood. Myth is a hall of mirrors. Every figure looks taller when another stands behind the glass. Present the evidence to a cool jury, and the weight goes where weight belongs. The timeline shoves Holiday north. The literary scandal steals authority from the loudest Wyatt tale. The Yuma confession collapses under cross-examination. The O'Rourke rumor evaporates in the heat. What remains in the oak shade is a human-sized ending. A man sick with liquor and memory, close enough to hear water and still choosing the closer silence of a single shot. It is neither heroic nor villainous. It is merely tragic, which is what most real endings are. Stand again at Turkey Creek and put your palm on the warm rock where a man might have rested his back. Imagine the mind that has carried Texas feuds, jailhouse nights, saddled miles, a near duel on Allen Street, and the knowledge that the Earps and the Cowboys have both burned out their brightest stars. Imagine wearing a coat that makes other men see a legend even when you are too tired to be one. The root fork of that blackjack oak is a kind of mercy seat. It offers a view of the canyon's Little Mercy, a ribbon of water, without the obligations of getting up again. The coroner's men read the room. So should we. When the legend becomes fact, the old movie line says, "Print the legend." Tombstone tried that and paid the price. Better to print what the witnesses wrote and let the silence do its work. Johnny Ringo's life carries all the noise a legend could want. Texas midnight rides, a pistol's bluff in Safford, a stare measured against Doc Holliday's. His death, for all the arguments, may be the one honest thing in the long account. It is spare, final, and sadly ordinary, a single mistake in a landscape that forgives nothing. That ordinariness is not an insult. It is an epitaph, one carved by the only jurors who mattered, the men who were there. If you stand at the grave as the day slants, when the oak throws a longer mercy across the stones and the creek keeps its soft counsel, you can feel how the land edits a man. It pares him down to the things that last, a name, a date, a rumor that refuses to lie still. Johnny Ringo's legend endures not because it is tidy, but because it disobeys tidiness. The frontier prefers its saints and sinners bright and easily sorted. Real men arrive with dust on them, carrying both scripture and sin in the same pocket. Those who knew him painted contradictory portraits that still hang side by side. One frame holds a quiet gentleman, deliberate in speech, inclined toward books when a room offered them, as if a paragraph could lower the day's temperature. In the other, a brooding drinker prowls the edges of his own temper, then steps over. Men remembered his courtesy the way they remember rain after a long drought. They remembered his rage the way they remember the flash that splits an oak. He did not chatter. He could be mannered in a parlor and merciless in a yard. The black coat, sometimes real, sometimes remembered into being, became shorthand for a complicated temperament. It told onlookers what they already wanted to believe, that here was a man who would not ask the room's permission. There is the oft-whispered claim that he quoted Shakespeare, a detail repeated so faithfully it has the shine of varnish. Perhaps he did. Perhaps those who admired his poise borrowed the bard to dignify it. The West has always liked to discover polish next to gun smoke, to imagine a Hamlet in a hat band, a Lear with a six-gun. Whether Ringo really spoke those lines or whether the town laid them on him afterward hardly matters to the myth. The point is the same. He moved between worlds, comfortable under a library's lamplight and a saloon's chimney soot, and the way he carried himself suggested that he had learned something heavy from both. But a legend does not grow from a man alone. It needs the soil that raised him. In the Texas hill country, where he was tempered, the land itself argued. Limestone shelves bitten by cedar, creek bottoms full of silt-slow water, German shopkeepers selling order by the yard, and American-born ranchers selling pride by the head. The Mason County quarrel did not erupt from nowhere. It rose from competing certainties. Immigrants brought guild habits, tax ledgers, and a distrust of night riders. Old stock settlers brought cattle codes and a distrust of courthouses that felt far away. When those two tempers met at a jailhouse door, the hinges learned a new vocabulary. Ringo's years there taught him how quickly a town can divide itself into shapes that won't fit back together without splinters. Arizona finished the lesson. Tombstone ran on a different kind of currency, ore crushed to slurry, money sluicing from far-off banks, men with Eastern collars calculating risks they would never have to ride. The law there wore a city face, ordinances against wearing iron under a coat, fines for a six-gun on Allen Street, patrols meant to make money feel safe at the saloon. The range outside town wore a different face, open, wind-ruled, where a brand could turn to smoke if a rider didn't defend it, where a man's honor was a thing he kept in his holster. No wonder the arguments multiplied. No wonder a man like Ringo, who understood both rooms and preferred neither, found himself translated into a symbol. The frontier drafts men to act out its own contradictions and then applauds or hangs them accordingly. Even the weather conspired to write his ending. Arizona's July is a gambler, promising storms with anviled clouds and then calling the bet back at the last second. The smell of creosote after the first fat drops makes your lungs think salvation is at hand, and then the rain tacks away, leaving heat that comes down like a lid. A man who has drunk too much, ridden too far, wrapped his feet to save them from the road. Such a man is at the mercy of small distances. Shade and water stand within a stone's throw and still do not save him. You could write a philosophy of frontier fate from that geometry alone. How close relief can be, how far when your strength quits a minute too soon. So the man in black becomes an emblem not just of one life, but of a time's crooked math. He is what happens when a boy watches his father die on the road and decides, perhaps without deciding, that the road is the only honest church he will ever attend. He is what happens when a feud teaches a young man that the ledger balances only in blood, and a boomtown teaches him that cash can rewrite any conclusion if you wait a day. He is what happens when a country tries to be two things at once, civilized and wild, and asks the same men to keep both faces smiling. His legacy splits like a trail at a dry fork. Down one track ride storytellers who need a final duel because anything quieter tastes like failure. They give him a last opponent in a theatrical noon and let the crowd decide which legend shoots straighter. Down the other ride those who accept the coroner's ledger. They visit the oak, count the steps from road to roots, and admit that private sorrow is as Western as gunsmoke. Both trails lead back to the same stones. The grave does not change its mind. What do we do with a figure who resists our categories? Perhaps we let him instruct us. Ringo's story warns against the arithmetic that reduces every man to the worst thing he did on his worst day. It also warns against the arithmetic that excuses everything because a man once read poetry by a parlor stove. The frontier is not tender. It does not remember compliments. It remembers shots fired and horses tied, and who went home and who did not. Ringo's courtesy and cruelty both deserve their place in the record. When we praise his composure, we should also remember the man bleeding in Safford from a bullet that should not have been fired. When we weigh his bravery, we should also weigh the way he let whiskey do his thinking. Honesty is the only tribute the dead can still use. And what of Tombstone's part in all this? Towns often get the myths they request. Investors of the day wanted a narrative of order, laws enforced, weapons checked, a street safe for commerce. Riders wanted a narrative of personal sovereignty, a man's word kept, an insult answered, a six-gun respected. The compromise looked like patrols and patrols interrupted, like ordinances and exceptions, like near duels arrested and vendetta rides blessed by federal paper. Out of such compromises, legends ferment, then burst their barrels. Ringo simply gave the legend a shape the printers could set in type: spare, stark, dangerous, and doomed. Today the pilgrimage is quiet. A pickup noses down a dirt lane. Someone steps out with a camera and a bottle of water and reads the plaque as if it might add a new sentence this year. The oak keeps making its small weather, leaf light, shade braided with sun, and the grave abides. Visitors speak softly because the place suggests it, and because to raise your voice here feels like correcting the land, which is a fool's errand. They take a photograph not to prove they stood where a gunman died, but to remember that even the loudest stories end in a hush. The harmonica wind plays through the canyon. The creek insists on its small business. The markers say what they say, and let 1,000 private opinions go on being private. If Ringo has a lesson, it may be this: the West is a mirror more than a stage. It shows you what you bring to it. Some will see him as a dark prince who deserved an end as hard as his beginnings. Some will see a troubled man ground down by bad seasons and worse companions. Some will see both and refuse to simplify the contradiction. That refusal is a kind of respect. It is also a way to keep the truth from disappearing into the hatband of a story you've heard too often. The man in black remains because the country that made him remains, no matter how many subdivisions rise where cattle once shouldered through mesquite. There is still a line between order and appetite, between the town that needs quiet to thrive and the range that needs room to breathe. We walk that line every day in our laws, our tempers, our appetites for simple endings. Johnny Ringo's name keeps showing up because it reminds us what the line can cost. He is the desert's parable, short on decoration, long on consequence, unafraid to leave the most important questions unanswered. When you leave the creek, dust will climb your ankles and the heat will reclaim your hat. You will look back once because people always do, and the tree will be exactly what it was when you arrived. Shade for the living, witness for the dead. If you listen as you go, you might hear the faintest echo, not of a gunshot, but of a man who measured a room with his eyes and decided, once finally, to measure himself. The legend will keep riding, the grave will keep still. Between them lies the thing every frontier story is truly about. How a man's choices carry him farther than any horse, and how the land in the end writes the last line.